Thanks, Chair, and thanks to the Minister. First of all, Minister, I'm slightly amused by the fact that there were two versions of your speech, and that the difference between the first and the second was that in the first you had a reference to the famous statement by Charlie McCreevy that we shouldn't quote, "When I've got it, I'll spend it," and the extreme damage that that policy pursued by a Fianna Fáil government did in creating the conditions for the economic collapse in 2008. So I'm just curious why you included that in the first version of your speech and then removed it. And I also wonder whether your government is not, in fact, guilty of making the same mistake, particularly in the area of the huge expenditures that are going out in HAPs, RAS and leasing arrangements to private property interests because of the failure of the state to directly invest and construct its own social housing stock. And therefore we are left in a situation, as is currently the case and will be for the foreseeable future, as I read your plans, of about €1 billion and probably set to rise every year going out in those sorts of payments to private property developers. Is that not a very significant and poor example of spending money in a profligate way that we shouldn't, when we need to instead replace that with direct investment in our own social housing stock, where the rental revenue will come back to us, and we will be able to use it to reinvest in more social housing. So I just put that point to you first, and maybe you could just confirm, because there's a figure being bandied around for Housing for All, that it's going to be $4 billion a year. In our discussions with the Parliamentary Budget Office, they pointed out that the actual direct exchequer funding is very significantly less than that, and that actually a lot of that spending that you imagine may happen to deliver the 330,000 houses by the end of the period of Housing for All, more than 50% of it you're hoping essentially will come from the private sector. So maybe you could just clarify that point for us. Secondly, I'll get the questions out now because I don't want you to talk down the clock. Secondly,
Empathy. I wouldn't do that.
I know you. Oh well, just in case. Secondly, can I question the false distinction that's often seems like a sensible one, but actually when examined closely, I think is often a false distinction between current and capital expenditure. I'll give you an example. We have significant skills and qualified sort of professional shortages in a whole range of areas, the health service, construction and engineering, and many other areas. Now, it seems to me the way you address that would be to create additional places in colleges and universities, which would be current expenditure, by creating additional places, by removing things like fees and other obstacles to people accessing higher education and postgraduate education. That would be current expenditure, but actually it would be an investment in the future, which would save us money down the line. I would make a similar point about our proposal that we should have things like free public transport. It would be additional current expenditure, but in the future it would save us on things like fines for carbon emissions and so on. So I just question that distinction, the merits of that distinction in many areas, and I could quote others, but I haven't got time. And lastly, tax expenditures. I pushed at this committee, and others have too, and our committee's agreed to examine tax expenditures as a huge shadow budget that we have every year that's not scrutinised in the same way as the direct expenditure budget. And we're proposing that those tax expenditures should be examined in the same sort of way during the budget as direct expenditures. And I'd like you to comment on that, because in my opinion, many of those expenditures are essentially tax loopholes which allow big corporations to evade tax. And just to give you one example, and maybe you'd comment on it, for the latest available figures for revenue, the cost of intra-group transactions, tax reliefs, are to the tune in 2019 of 16 billion euro in lost revenue. And I presume that's accruing to some of the big multinational corporations who use transfer pricing to avoid their tax obligations. 16 billion euro in just one category of tax relief. Aren't these things that frankly should be closed down, but at the very least examined in a very detailed way as part of the budgetary process?
Okay, thanks, Chair. Thanks very much, Deputy. Given the warning you've issued to me about not speaking for too long, I'm going to try and be really quick. First answer, I just made the same point in different words. Apologies for two speeches being issued to the committee. Have to make sure the same doesn't happen on Budget Day. In relation to your second point about the use of the HAP and the use of housing-related payments, Deputy, I would love to be in a position that we don't have to make as much use of those payments as we are in the future. But while we are in a situation that we're building more public and social housing, that we're rebuilding our public housing stock, I do believe those payments play a role in supporting those who need long-term secure rental accommodation, while more permanent plans and more permanent homes are being made available to them. Thirdly, in relation to your point on capital expenditure, yeah, it's sometimes a bit of a blurrier line than economic textbooks might indicate. But from a policy point of view, there still has to be a segmentation because there is a world of difference between making a decision, for example, to hire 1,000 more teachers in any given year and then committing to building a new public capital project that has a finite endpoint, at the end of which you can make the decision as to whether you want to maintain the spending or not, with little of the difficulties that's sometimes associated with the management of current spending. And then on your final point about a review of tax expenditures, as a matter of policy, we review all tax expenditures every 3 years.
How much time have I got, Chair?
A minute and a half, Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Yeah, okay, just very quickly, Minister. First of all, I would like you to comment on the intra-group transactions and the capital allowances, which are the two biggest categories of tax reliefs. And to my mind are just examples of aggressive tax avoidance by major multinationals. 16 billion for the year 2019, about 6 billion in capital allowances, and then of course there's the research and development tax relief. The other thing just to mention on climate, you're going to increase the carbon tax once again. The ESRI has said that is regressive for people on lower incomes when they have little control over their ability to actually reduce their energy use because of, say, the quality of their housing. Isn't that just the case? Aren't they correct? Isn't it going to increase fuel poverty? And particularly given that, for example, in most local authorities next year, the retrofit plans for social housing are only 1% of the housing stock, so that many of the people will have no control over the heating they need to keep their houses warm, but you're going to punish them with further increases in carbon tax.
So the ESRI report would also acknowledge that there needs to be plans in place that mitigate the effect of an increase in carbon pricing for those particularly who are in fixed income, which is why budget by budget we've made changes in the fuel allowance. And my recollection is the changes that we have made have been successful in protecting lower income parts of our lower income citizens within our society from the more difficult consequences of an increase in carbon pricing. And there's also data and evidence available to show that has happened. In relation to the point about use of capital allowances and intra-group transfers, I disagree fundamentally with you in describing those as tax loopholes in any way. That is just a consequence of the fact that we have so many companies located here in Ireland that are managing either the European or even the global dimension of their businesses outside of our country. in Ireland, but managing large businesses that take place in other parts of the world from Ireland. And that inevitably means that changes take place to deal with transfer pricing, to deal with transfer of funds from companies within a broader organisation that are part of how larger corporations run their businesses. I do accept that the figures are high, but I would not accept the characterisation of them as being in any way tax loopholes. And to re-emphasise, all tax expenditures are reviewed every 3 years.
Thank you.